My name is Rowan Braybrook, and I'm the Director of Programs at Northwest Natural Resource Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second session of the Northwest Innovative Forestry Summit's virtual series. This virtual series is a sequel to last year's virtual conference, and it's a prequel to this fall's in-person conference at Pack Forest, which will be happening September 30th to October 2nd. So look forward to seeing you all then. Today's session is focusing on forestry and public discourse and consciousness. And this session, as with all the sessions, is co-hosted by the Forest Stewards Guild, Intertribal Timber Council, Northwest Natural Resource Group, Oregon State University, and University of Washington. So thanks to all of our partners. I think those of you who joined our last session probably see this as familiar, so I'll just go through this quickly. The Northwest Innovative Forestry Summit is building on a long history of innovation in the Pacific Northwest. And we see this as a venue for regional learning and ongoing cooperation in order to implement sound forest management strategies. It's really part of an ongoing effort with a number of groups to connect and innovate ideas in the realm of forest and forestry in our beautiful region. During today's call, we definitely suggest you change your Zoom name to your name and association if possible. You can do that by right-clicking on your picture and hitting rename, and that will allow you to put in your association so people know who you are and who you're representing. During the presentations, we ask that everyone keep themselves muted and use the Zoom chat to ask any questions or comment either during or after the presentations. And of course, we always ask that everyone is respectful of one another. We also have a Mighty Networks group, which we can share the link to, and that is kind of an ad-free version of Facebook a little bit. It's a very focused discussion on a number of forestry topics, and we'll have space there for us to continue the discussion in between our sessions, between these virtual sessions and our in-person sessions later this year. So with that said, I am very happy to introduce our moderator for today. Seth Zuckerman is currently the Executive Director of Northwest Natural Resource Group, and he has 25 years of experience along the West Coast's forests and watersheds, working with the natural lands. So Seth, over to you.
All right, well, thanks so much, Rowan. Our conversation today is going to be about the stories that we tell about forest stewardship, how those have changed in the last few decades, and how that changing narrative has affected the practice of forestry, which in turn affects the stories we tell, and so on. To talk about this, we have three people with us to kick off the conversation and take it through the first half or so of our time together, after which we'll open things up to Q&A. Which I hope will lead to a conceptually freewheeling but logistically moderated discussion. We're going to hear from each of those people with a few minutes of opening remarks, and then they'll join together in conversation, and after that, the Q&A. So a conservationist, an academic, and a journalist walk into a bar. That's not the beginning of a joke. It's actually our panel for today, minus the bar part, unfortunately, and we'll have to save that for the in-person summit this fall. So today we'll be joined by Lynda Mapes, a reporter for the Seattle Times, and Brenda McComb, a retired forestry professor from Oregon State, both of whom I'll introduce at greater length when it's time for their opening remarks. But first, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Paula Swedeen, Policy Director at Conservation Northwest. Paula has worked on habitat conservation issues around the Pacific Northwest for more than 2 decades. She was 12 years a wildlife biologist and endangered species policy analyst with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Washington DNR, and now serves on Washington's Forest Practices Board and the Wolf Advisory Board. Her recent work involves creating markets and ecosystem service payments to incentivize better habitat conditions on private lands where the reach of regulation is limited. So take it away, Paula.
I will do that. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I'm just going to have some slides that are going to crank through a little bit. So I'm not going to give a PowerPoint presentation, but I am going to have some pictures for maybe prompting discussion. Let's see. All right. So my biography is a slight bit out of date. I'm a little older than when that was written, so it's now been a little over 3 decades since I've been working on forest conservation issues. And I did rotate off the State Forest Practices Board at the end of 2020. So just wanted to improve accuracy there for a little bit. I think I also wanted to start by saying this is about public discourse around forest stewardship and forest management issues. And my perspective on that is necessarily going to be constrained, or my standpoint is going to be constrained by my background and my history. And so I don't want to purport to speak for or have like a universal view of the entire public discourse around it. But I do hope, given my range of experience working for public agencies and then working in the nonprofit sector, that it will be at least reflective of a pretty good slice of the dialogue. So, when I started my career, I cut my teeth on the spotted owl wars, starting in 1989, 90. I moved to Washington in 1990, started working for the Forest Service doing spotted owl surveys, and I had moved from the Midwest. And that was where, I'm actually gonna start this over again. That was where I encountered the majestic old growth of the Pacific Northwest for the very first time. And it was really striking. It was something that I did not really have experience with in the flatlands of the Midwest, and it deeply affected me. It affected how I looked at the world, and it changed the course of my career. And learning that these forests were being harvested at an alarming rate, learning that it was causing not only flagship species like the spotted owl and marble murrelet, and our some monid species to become endangered, but that there's literally thousands of species associated with these with our native old growth forests. And so participating in all of the activities to slow and eventually stop that harvest was that was something that was important to me, and that I worked on as an activist and a citizen alongside my professional career. And then during those years in the sort of starting in the mid 90s, when I was working for Department of Natural Resources, my attention focused to state land management, and DNR manages about 2.2 million acres of forest, and they had significant exposure to endangered species issues, and so trying to figure out not only, and so I helped them write their habitat conservation plan on their forest lands, but the issues became more like, yes, how do we conserve what's on the ground in a pattern that makes sense for the species, but then also like, how do we grow back new stuff? And it was in those years of realizing that there were very strong economic incentives to, once you had legal requirements to stop harvesting old growth, there were still these really, really strong economic incentives that would not allow trees like this to grow back. And so trying to figure out what we do about that became very important. And so that's where I was, engaging in public discourse then about more about economic incentives than regulations. And I did participate in discussions in the regulatory sphere on conservation of spotted owls and marble murrelets on state and private land, mostly on private land. But it became very apparent that was really about figuring out how not to harvest like the last little scraps. And if we were going to try to figure out how to grow back, and most of the science said that we didn't have enough left of these complex, lovely forests on the combination of public and private land, that we were going to need to restore more forest. And so there has been, I think, a good chunk of dialogue that's been going on since that time. And that was a time that I really started getting into forest carbon markets. And because there is such an overlap in the sequestration of carbon and allowing forests to grow older than normal rotation ages. And so that's been, that has been a big part of my career ever since then. Not to say that I haven't paid attention to the regulatory issues, but again, that's mostly been focused on salmon under forest and fish. And that's been even on a smaller slice of the landscape, I would say, 20% are within riparian areas. Depending on the landscape, there might be a few places that are more. And so really the societal-wide discussion of how do we restore these forests for endangered species? But then as we've learned more, 30 years ago, certainly we were aware of climate change, but we didn't have the awareness of how bad it was going to get and our prospects for being able to deal with it. And so, now we've got, and this is just a slide showing the rapid rate of harvest from starting in the 60s of spotted owl habitat on our major national forests. This is a backdrop of the discussion on employment impacts of doing anything different other than harvesting on industrial rotations. And this is showing that we employ a lot fewer people per 1,000 board feet harvested, and that even started in the 90s. So job loss had been a pretty big deal even prior to the spotted owl being listed. That's a landscape, a private landscape next to a public landscape in the foothills of the Southern Cascades in the Mineral Block area. But it's this picture that's showing everything in red has been harvested in the last 20 years, essentially. And so we have these really powerful economic incentives that not only since most of the old growth was harvested by 1990, but it continues a rapid harvest rate that is suboptimal for carbon sequestration and certainly suboptimal for habitat. And so I have been engaged in a sector of the discourse about how do we change that, and how do we change it not only for biodiversity, but how do we change it for water quality, and how do we change it for employing every last tool that we can to draw down carbon dioxide. And so I will stop there and pass it off to Brenda, or pass it off to you to introduce Brenda.
All right, thank you. I actually just have a follow-up question. Would you that all that red, are those places that were clear cut or simply had any sort of harvest? So if a stand was thinned, would it still show up there in red?
Not likely. So I can pass the website around so people can use it, but you can zoom in. And again, like I said, except for on the eastern side where there's some big blotches of fires that have happened over the last 3 years, everything in Western Washington, West Slip of the Cascades, that's in red there has been clear cut. So when you zoom in, you can see the boundary of the clear cuts.
Got it.
Yeah, and there are, I do believe that satellite tool has a feature where you can detect some lighter harvests and more partial harvests. But yeah, that's, you have to have lost most of the vegetation to be able to have a red spot.
Got it. Okay. Well, I have some more questions for you, but I think I'll hold them until later, after when we get into the conversation among all three of you. But for now, let's see if we can, if you wouldn't mind stopping the screen share, Paula. Thank you. And I'll introduce Brenda, who is Brenda McComb is a retired professor at the OSU Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society. She previously served on the faculty at the University of Kentucky, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and OSU, and also as the chief of the Watershed Ecology branch in Corvallis for the US EPA. She holds a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Connecticut and a PhD in forestry from Louisiana State University. She also serves now on the Oregon Board of Forestry and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. Thanks for joining us today, Brenda, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Seth. Appreciate that. So before I begin, I just want to offer a disclaimer, and that is the comments and views that I'm going to share today are my own and in no way reflect the views or positions of the Board of Forestry or the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. What I'd like to do is just reflect a little bit back on the past 25, 30 years, but then also look forward over the next 20 or 25 years and pose some questions maybe that might get some conversation started. When I arrived in Oregon a number of years ago, the debate was really around, as Paula pointed out, maintaining old growth or business as usual in terms of clear-cut plant, perhaps then and harvest. And a number of us at OSU began to think, well, there must be a middle ground here. Where is that middle ground? How can we continue to harvest some trees, but also think about how to build complexity into these stands, how to provide habitat for a variety of species, obviously, but other values too. And so several of us began a project 25 years ago on McDonald Dunn Forest. There have been subsequent projects since that explored a whole range of possible actions that you could take to try to develop complexity into these middle-aged stands and remove timber, but also gain dead wood, big trees, hardwoods, more complexity in the stands. We learned a lot. And in fact, some of that work is still continuing on by Klaus Putman. He is doing much more elegant research than I have ever done, and has a lot of answers to questions that we've had for years. And I point that out mostly to indicate that the information is there. The research has been done for decades now. We know how to manage forests to a greater or lesser degree in ways other than what is typically done on forest industry lands. And we're starting to see that these practices grow, especially on non-industrial private forest lands. So I think that's one change that I would point out, but we still have a lot to learn. And I think Klaus would agree with that as well. How you go about meeting certain goals, certain values, and extending rotations in a meaningful way that is also economically viable, I think are still areas where we have work to do. But the information's there. The question is, is it being used? And yes, it is in some sectors, and no, it isn't, and probably never will be in other sectors. And so, we still have some work to do, I think, in terms of trying to build some complexity and resilience and resistance into some of our forests, which gets me to kind of the next part of what I wanted to mention today. And that is, what do we want as our forests for the future? If we look ahead 25 years rather than back, look ahead 25 years, given the rate at which the climate is changing, given the frequency of intense or extreme events that occur as a result of climate change, given the impacts that those events are having on forests, either through fire or wind or floods or insects or diseases or whatever. What do we want our forests to do? And if we want them to do things, what are we going to give to those forests to allow them to meet those needs? And so I made a list, and I admit that this is a very brief list, mostly designed to generate some questions and discussions. So to take it with that background. But I've got 7 things that I think forests in the future need to do. They need to withstand pulses of intense weather. heat, wind, flooding, prolonged drought, snow, whatever it might be, whatever climate change is going to throw at us in terms of intense weather events, they need to be able to withstand that. They need to impede the spread of wildfire. And that means having different tree species which are more or less flammable distributed across a landscape in a manner that will at least break up the spread of wildfire, unlike what we see in closed canopy plantations. We need forests that are resistant to increasing levels in distribution and types of diseases and damaging insects. Climate change is likely to see some changes there. We need to have tree species that will replace the ones that die out, and they will. There are tree species that we will see disappear from certain areas, and perhaps with assisted migration, we might see them pop up in others. We need to continue to provide enough wood products to allow some regularly spaced mills to continue to operate, because those mills provide us with the opportunity to actually manage these forests, which we will have to do in the face of climate change. We need to continue to provide habitat for protected species, provide clean water, provide clean air, all the regulatory requirements. So there's that framework that needs to continue. And perhaps most importantly, we need to sequester and store carbon in the forest and in very long-lived wood products. And that means lengthening rotations, and it means using the products that come from that in a form that is not going to end up in the landfill in a decade or so. So those are the things that I see our forests we need in the future. My question to the group here is the current way that we're managing our forests likely to meet those needs, meet those expectations? And I think I'll just leave it there. I think that there are certainly landowners in this Forest Stewards Guild that would say, yes, they're making progress. But I think if we look across the landscape generally, we might get some different answers depending upon who's doing the managing. So I'll leave it there, Seth, and maybe pass it on.
All right. Thank you, Brenda. Maybe I'll just ask a follow-up question, because there's sort of an underlying premise lurking here, which is that we can, through science and knowledge and the work that you're doing, and now Klaus is continuing on that thinning study, that we can gain more knowledge and then introduce that into the policy arena. And I'm just wondering if you feel like there's been a change over the time you've been involved here in the Northwest in the strength of science as an influence on policy, or is truth just every bit as contested in science and academia as it is in, say, the news media?
Well, so that's a really great question, and we could go on that topic for a long time. Policy decisions in the state of Oregon are to be based upon the best available science. That's written into statute. But then who decides what the best available science is? And you can have one data set analyzed by two different people in two different ways and have two different conclusions. And so what we often see is information brought before groups like the Board of Forestry, but then you need to have kind of the full spectrum of interpretation of those data to really understand how that information can be used in a policy arena. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind with policy and the use of information is that we have years and decades of information that can be used to help guide policy. But that's retrospective. That's looking back over those 25 years. Climate change is not retrospective. It is in the future. And we have downscale climate models, which will allow us to understand what the likely effects are of future climate changes in various places, various regions across the Northwest. But within a policy framework, we're not using model projections to base policy becomes very contentious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there's uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I'll just share a screen here for a second before we move on to Lynda, since you come back again to the question of climate change is just this study here of, there's a study of pollen that was done a long time ago, about 30 years ago now, looking at the pollen that accumulated in lake sediments in various parts of the Northwest, that gives a picture of how things changed in the course of the last 20, anywhere from 12 to 20,000 years. And you can see that, from having pine and spruce forest, and then alder came in, and Douglas fir, and then it's really only in the last maybe 6,000 years that the composition of the forest has been much like what we have known our entire lives. So I found this really instructive, just because it puts in a larger temporal context the kind of changes that we're seeing. Although, of course, now, as someone pointed out when we were just chatting before the panel, the rate of change is, of course, much faster and has been accelerated by human activity. So thanks, Brenda. I'm going to introduce Lynda now, our last panelist. Lynda Mapes is a reporter at the Seattle Times, where she specializes in the coverage of environment, indigenous cultures, and governments. Over the course of her career, she's written 6 books, including Witness Tree, exploring the human and natural history of a single 100-year oak, and has won numerous awards, including the International 2019 and 2012 Kavli Gold Award for Science Journalism from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Thanks, Lynda, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Seth. It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, everybody. I can offer some perspective as a reporter working in Washington State for, since 1992. And I think I was asked by Seth to reflect a little bit on what's changed during that time in the coverage of forestry and forests and in the stories that I'm telling. And boy, I immediately knew what the answer to that question is. And I'm sure you can guess, it's climate. I mean, this sense of climate doom and an apocalypse of species loss, and it's really a twin crisis of loss of biodiversity and loss of forests and loss of a stable climate, all because of the human activity of fossil fuel burning. And I love the pollen record slides that Seth just showed us. It's, however, is a chastening slide, sweet to look at, because that used to be the rate of change in our world. It used to be this adagio played out over tens of millions of years, thousands of years. That is not what we're living in right now, as we all know. I mean, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's the old hockey stick graph. You've seen it since the industrial age to now. That amount of increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, that used to take epochs, glacial epochs to accomplish, and we did it in the space of 150 years. So, it's a bathtub with a plug, and the natural world does have that beautiful tuning mechanism of the forests and the oceans, but they can only let so much of that CO2 out of the bathtub. It's a pretty small plug compared to the fire hose of emission that we're putting in the bathtub. So forests help us. 30% of our emissions globally get soaked up by the forests, but that doesn't mean that'll ever be enough. We're losing forests. As we lose forests, they themselves are turning into negative feedback loops and spewing CO2. Furthermore, the rate of change just keeps speeding up. So what's changed in coverage of forests? All of a sudden, I'm writing about climate all the time. And I'm writing about how climate is pushing a sense of urgency into the general public that is both good and bad. I mean, there's a sense of climate doom. There's a sense of having kind of burned through literally our margin of time and even social grace to enact change. People are impatient. They're literally storming the barricades. Our Department of Natural Resources here in Washington State has never had a tree sit until last year. And I think that sense of social license, that it's, cutting trees is a good thing. We cut trees, we pay for schools with trees. That's what we are. It's how we do it. That's eroding. And I mean, really fast. There's a sense now that was then, And this is now. And when you look at the amount of money that goes into the school trust here in Washington State from, and also other hospital districts, library districts, and so forth, you add it all up, honestly, it's not very much money. And people are beginning to look at our state forest lands anyway, and asking the question, really, maybe we need to come up with something else. And in our state, there's just a sense that DNR, our Department of Natural Resources, is a little too slow off the mark in adapting to this new world that we find ourselves in, kind of a little bit of too little, too late, and that these publicly owned forests have a special job to do. We have seen a situation where the conservationists in our state, the environmentalists and others, have had to go all the way to the Supreme Court in order to ask what you'd think would be a pretty straightforward policy question, which is, you know, what other good are these forests here to serve? Was it really meant to just pay dollars to trust beneficiaries? Aren't these forests for all the people? And if that's the case, aren't these other benefits such as stabilizing climate, open space, watershed protection, clean water, biodiversity, where are they in this calculus? And they've had to go to the Supreme Court for that. You know, that is interesting. And I think to a lot of people, dispiriting in terms of the rate of change that we're witnessing. It's very real, and yet the politics seem very slow to catch up. I would add to that just in the last week or so, we've seen something new in Washington, which is our first ever state public carbon reserve. Very interesting that it would come now on the eve of a decision in the Supreme Court. I draw no conclusion from that other than to say, okay, great. You know, she's now doing, Hillary Franz, our Commissioner of Public Lands, is doing exactly the sort of thing that these environmental groups have gone all the way to the Supreme Court to try to, you know, get them to say they could do, namely utilize state forests for other benefits beyond just cash for beneficiaries. Now, very interestingly, the concept here is that this carbon reserve will generate cash for the trust by the sale of carbon credits. That you've got polluters out there, they envision large businesses that will want to pay good money for carbon so that they can take care of their problem. And that'll make money for the trust. And Hillary Franz, our Commissioner of Public Lands, has said, well, you know, this could even be better for the trust than timber revenues, more stable. Maybe so. She envisions this will be a big success, and I think all of us hope she's right. It's a funny thing. Carbon, everyone talks about it, but yet the price for carbon right now is still rather low compared to, of course, the price of timber. But and so does that mean that the state is willing to take a little bit of a loss there just because of the larger benefit for climate? Isn't that what we've been saying all along? So it's an interesting time that we're having this conversation today. There's a lot going on in Washington that's edging into some new ground. It is a tiny step. It's only 0.5% of our entire forested land base in Western Washington, so super tiny. I think there's a lot of hope that could maybe get bigger. Talking with Jerry Franklin, who we all look to him for guidance and science and wisdom. And first thing he said to me was, well, you know, if you really want to do something, forget these toy forests on DNR lands, go where the action is. You know, we need the industrial landowners to step it up, that they're not going for any social benefit at all on those lands. These are farms, they're getting turned at 40-year rotations. We're sending logs in the hole to China to be cement forms from our lands in Washington. Why are we doing that? And that's a very interesting question in the year 2022. He's 85 years old. He's been fighting for big trees all his life. He's down in Oregon now on a sale, a Forest Service sale. And, you know, this is a little bit of big stuff that was left out of the matrix in the forest plan, and it's now matured. And I would say one of the other big things that's new and different in the narrative is it is becoming not as binary, just industrial lands, old growth. There's a whole new conversation and even a new language that's emerging in the stories in Washington about so-called legacy forests. What are these? These are not old growth under our policies of the state. They're certainly not just production lands. These are older trees. These are mature forests that are very often regrown from sloppy cuts made in much earlier times when they didn't take it all and they didn't use industrial practices. We're talking about people with saws and oxen. And I was on one of these forests just recently in Preston. You know when you see them, you know them as soon as you walk in. There's the diversity of species. There's the complex canopy. There's the beautiful understory. There's evidence of animal life all around you. This is in earshot of I-90. So we're not talking about some remote place, but there's a stand there that they just kind of never got to for a variety of reasons. And we have these all over Washington. And these so-called legacy forests have really burst into the public conversation. Here in Washington, suddenly we're seeing people, turning out at Board of Natural Resources meetings by the dozen. You've had city councils and county commissioners, even in rural places, asking the Board of the Forest Practices Boards to delay sales because they value these legacy forests for watershed protection, for recreation. We've not seen that before. And so I want to sort of lift up this new conversation that's happening and say it isn't just about old growth and industrial lands anymore. It's also about this sort of new category of appreciation for these legacy forests. And why is that happening? It's happening because of climate. It's happening because of population growth and people having a sense of running out of time and running out of space. And I don't think that's going to abate. I think it's only going to intensify. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to participate in this today is I think groups like this that are looking at innovation and new ways to work and also communicate are where it's going to be at. People like me, I'm a reporter. I'm interested in following trends, and one of the things that's really on my radar right now are all these sort of new things that people are offering as eco-forestry, right? They're good for the forest and good for the woods and good for everybody. And I know whenever I hear win-win, I figure I'm not getting any. A lot of skepticism about anything called win-win. But I am interested in whether things like, ecological thinning is a new term I'm hearing, whether that's a thing. Is that something that can help convert some of these really just mutilated industrial forests that, really can't function ecologically anymore because their dog hair stands? Can you thin those back to health? Is that a thing? Should we be doing that? Does that create wood? Is cross-laminated timber actually a green thing? It probably depends on your wood source, doesn't it? So it's never very satisfying to the public when the answer is it depends. But with a lot of this that's being put out there now as new things, green things, good things, it depends. It depends on how it's done. It depends on what the wood source is. It depends on how long the product stays a carbon stable source rather than getting chucked in a landfill. So we seem to be in this it depends time. So you should know that as practitioners, as landowners, as people communicating science, it's a time of urgency, a time of it depends. People aren't necessarily going to buy it when you say it. They're going to want to have you show them why. They're going to want to come out on the landscape and see it. They're going to want to drill in and learn more because it really is a time of great urgency. We live in the last best place. We're going to be the place where everybody comes as everything gets hotter. We're going to have the last water. We're going to have the last forest. We're going to have the last open space. We're going to be it. We're moderated by the Pacific Ocean. We don't, even as much as we are seeing change, it's nothing like everywhere else. So, know that. You are guardians of the last best place, and the forests, they're the key to everything. Water, biodiversity, temperature, carbon, and human well-being. So that's what I see by way of change. There's a new sense of urgency. There's a new appreciation for a forest people wouldn't have looked twice at 10 years ago, even.
Before I throw it open to the rest of the panel for open conversation, I was just curious, you talked about the collapse of social license on for harvest on state lands. do you see any places as you talk to all the different, your spectrum of sources where over the last 20 or 30 years, people's opinions have converged?
Yes, I definitely do. And that's on the absolute dire necessity of maintaining these lands in forests, especially private landowners, that if we make it impossible, unprofitable, undoable to keep these private landowners on the land, then we're really cooked. I mean, if all this land converts to development, that's forever. Now, clear cuts, that's not great. Paving's worse. So one thing that has come up as a consensus, I bet Paula would agree with this, is that we need to do whatever we can to keep small private landowners and privately owned forest land in forestry, and be really thoughtful about anything that would subvert that. And this is where the carbon conversation comes back. If we had a righteous carbon price, it seems to me that would solve a lot. I mean, if you could make money by growing trees bigger, isn't that the magic answer? I mean, and it's not like that's new, right? I see the Nisqually River people here. I mean, the Nisqually Land Trust brilliantly brokered a sale to Microsoft a long time ago. I wrote that story, I don't even know, 10 years ago. Microsoft bought a bunch of trees as a carbon sink on Mount Rainier. So, and they did it through California, their carbon market. So it just seems to me that if you ask me, are there things that are converging? Are there points of consensus? For sure, it's keeping whatever we've got and making sure that we don't incentivize getting rid of it to make a mall or a little 5-acre ranchettes. That's the terror.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And now I'd just like to open it first to Brenda and to Paula. If you have other questions you want to, or contributions, reactions, responses you'd like to pose to one another.
Well, I can build a little bit on what Lynda was just saying. And that's, I completely agree that conversion's a big deal. But I worry about that conversation sometimes because it can get cast as an either or. Like, either you allow or encourage or even incentivize business as usual practices, or you endanger the land for potential conversion. And I think it's much more, it's more complex than that, but I think there's also a need to incentivize restoration forestry or ecologically based forestry and make it financially viable, as a hedge against both conversion and underutilizing the forest land base that we have to solve all of the problems we need to solve. So that's one point I would make. And then the point about carbon markets. So I've been working in the carbon market space for about 20 years. The price has not gone up anywhere near as high yet as we thought it would. I don't think it will ever. If we just look at offset markets on their own as one of the drivers of changing forest land management, I don't think that it'll ever reach a price that's at parity with foregone opportunity cost of harvesting timber. And so we need to look at carbon payments in a different way. And so the Climate Commitment Act that the Washington State Legislature passed last year includes funding for nature-based climate solutions. And that opens the door for different kinds of deals. So for instance, you could use that funding, and there's going to be a little over $600 million in that fund generated between 2023 and 2040. So it's a fair chunk of change. It's not all going to go to forestry. But with that money, you could create a program where you could offer a landowner to purchase a conservation easement, and the value of that conservation easement would be the delta between what they would make, in the shorter term on a 40-year rotation or whatever their normal forest practices are, and a form of management that sequesters more. And it doesn't need to be stopping harvest. It can be switching from clear cutting to periodic thinning. It can be gradual lengthening of rotations, but a landowner could quantify the kind of contribution they want to make. They could sign an easement that memorializes their commitment, and they could get paid up front for it at a level that is higher than they're ever going to get in the offset market. And California has been doing that. California has an offset market, but they also have a funding mechanism that's very similar, and they've been financing conservation easements that both prevent against development and improve forest management. So, it's a rich topic, but I'll stop there. Just wanted to build on a couple of things that Lynda was saying there.
And all that incredibly hopeful. I mean, the idea of having these different tools in the box, that's exactly what it's going to take. It's going to take a whole range of options. And, I often hear a real desire out there of landowners for exactly these kinds of solutions. And so I think that, when I hear that, all I can say is amen. I mean, that's what we need. And and I hope that one good thing leads to another. I just really think we are in a space of needing new answers. So it isn't binary, cut it or let them cut it, or it's going to be houses isn't good enough. Obviously, it can't be that, your money or your life. It needs to be more creative than that. And I think that to the extent too that we can start demonstrating some more of these things on the landscape. This is where, as a reporter, I get excited. If I can show some of these things to the public in a news article, say, see, this is happening here. It's actually, there are these other options. And, I just think that the kind of thing you're talking about, Paula, conservation easement to close that gap, people are looking for that. These landowners, especially the smaller private landowners, they want to be stewards, but they're real. They need the same things all the rest of us need. They have kids, they have legacy plans, they got all the stuff they got to take care of. So that's good news. And I just wish it was all happening faster. Oh.
So I'll just jump in quickly here. I think the incentives to move forest management toward ecological forestry, longer rotations, complexity in the stands and across the landscape, redundancy, all of those things would be great. But there will probably need to be a suite of incentives. Carbon credits are clearly one avenue, but policy changes are another. And that's always fraught with the politics behind those changes. But I think there's a moral imperative on the part of agencies and really any landowner to begin to start to make some of these decisions and provide some incentives. I think it's probably naive on my part to expect the moral imperative to go very far with some landowners, but it's going to go a long ways with others. And certainly I've seen it on some non-industrial private forest lands here in Oregon, as well as lands managed in a trust. Pacific Forest Trust is certainly doing things along those lines. So we're making progress, I think, but we've got a long ways to go, and we need a toolbox full of incentives to help us get there. Carbon is one, but it's not necessarily the best one in all circumstances, given the uncertainty that we have in the future around climate change.
I'm curious if you think, Paula, there's anything that we could do to get a better result on the industrial timberlands than 40-year rotations and logs in the round going to China. Every time I see that pile up at Port Angeles, I just don't feel real good. It's like, really? We're doing that still? You're kidding. Can't they get their cement forms some other way? I don't know. I can't even believe it. It just doesn't seem smart. I mean, what could we do as a state, as a society to knock that off? What kind of law would you pass? What kind of rule would you change? Got any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've been thinking about in depth and trying to come up with both policy proposals and financial incentives for quite some time. It's a really tricky area, and I look forward to when we're opening up the conversation and see what other people in the room have been doing or thinking about this. But so that mechanism that I had just talked about with Climate Commitment Act, and a similar thing that's been happening down in California, it recognizes that the conclusion that I've come to from both observing timber land markets and having discussions with industrial landowners and executives and owners of those companies, is that the current system is incredibly lucrative, and it's really difficult to change.
Yeah.
So the price of timberland is very expensive. There's a lot of money chasing not enough land. And so landowners that currently own a lot of land in the most productive tree growing, which is also the most productive carbon sequestration parts of our state, the big companies want to buy more land so they can keep that management style going.
Yeah.
And then I remember a conversation I had with, I think I got the same answer from two different people, and one was an executive for a very large company, and the other one was an economist for WFPA. And the answer is essentially, you can't pay us to grow our trees longer. You couldn't ever figure out a way to pay us enough to change our business model, because the business model works so well. But you're welcome to try to buy our land when we put it up for sale.
Wow.
And that was a good 10 years ago, and those conditions have only set in more. So that's why I've been looking for ways to try to create funds, like to try to create pools of larger public funding to be able to buy that land, and then that also helps us take advantage of. There is a lot of impact investment. So people who have a lot of money, private investors, and large corporations that are wanting to do good things for climate, they want to invest, but they eventually want their money back out. And so we need public funding, so someone can come in and be a bridge financer when there's a timberland auction, and they can help pull off a purchase and partner with someone like the Nisqually Community Forest or the Nisqually Land Trust or the other community forests that are popping up around the state. They can partner with them. They can help them purchase that land, but they eventually want their money back at some rate of investment. And so the only really way to do that is to have public funds to do the buyout eventually. And so this Climate Commitment Act fund is going to help a lot, but it's not going to be enough. We need more. So I would love stronger public advocacy for a bond issuance, like a green infrastructure bond issuance that's at least $1 billion, because we have so many both mitigation and adaptation needs in the climate space that forests can meet. And then, I don't want to take up too much of the time, but there is this issue of leakage. We can't just stop harvesting, right? We do need wood products, and we don't want to just export the emissions that come from harvest and use of wood products someplace else. So strengthening or lengthening rotations in a manner that transitions in a way that we don't have a big dip. So we keep the mills working. So we make wood products, but the embodied carbon of those wood products is higher, and we don't have emissions. We lower the emissions and or increase the sequestration that's linked to the way we make wood products. And really the only way to do that is either lengthen rotations or switch to a continuous thinning model. So anyway, those are some thoughts about dealing with the industrial land base, but super, super difficult economic headwinds to deal with there.
Yeah. This idea of a green infrastructure bond, I feel like that's been around for a while, and I can't figure out why it doesn't happen. It just seems to make so much sense. Treat these forests like the utility that they are, and monetize it. That just needs to get done in the legislature or in an initiative. I mean, we have the initiative process here. It just seems like such a clear-minded idea, and it utilizes tools we're familiar with, markets and investments, and I don't know. It just makes sense to me, and it seems like we're so insistent on not seeing forests for what they are, which is clean water utilities and carbon cleaners. I mean, that there are a lot of other things, but that's what they do for a living. You couldn't stop it if you tried. You know, that's what they do, and they'll do it forever. You know, we've got the species that really do it forever, like Doug fir and red cedar. So, you know, let them do what they know how to do, because we need it done. And it just drives me wild that we're not implementing that tool, because we know about it. I don't know, makes so much sense. And I think that, you know, sometimes we just get in our own way, and we can't be afraid of politics. I mean, at the end of the day, you can have all the science in the world. We're not going to science our way out of this, people. These are values choices. And we decide, okay, we're evergreen state people, we're a salmon people, and that's going to mean something, or it isn't. You want to be California, go be California. You can do it. And we'll get there. We'll get there in 50 years. Is that what you want? I mean, I'm very used to this dynamic in orcas and salmon, which is a lot of what I write about. And you want to be California? It's easy. Just go there. You can see it. That's what you'll be. Count on it. I'm from the East Coast, you see, so I feel like empowered to say these things because we already did it there, right? I mean, started in Europe, came to the East Coast of the United States. Now it's out here. You're the last place with salmon, with orcas, with big forests. You're it. Really, I promise. It's true. So
Yeah.
if it actually matters to people out here, they're going to have to fight for it, or it really will be gone. And I came out here in 92, as I said, and people said to me, oh, you'll see, we're different. I thought, maybe, maybe not. Maybe you just started 150 years later. Show me. I'm waiting. I'm still waiting.
I'll just like to mention one other thought experiment for influencing industrial landowners. And, you know, NNRG is not a policy organization, so I have the luxury of just offering this as a thought experiment. But, you know, if you think about the forest excise tax, which is 5% of stumpage value on any timber that's harvested, what if that wasn't just a flat 5%? What if it was, say, 10 or 15% if you harvest your forests below age 40 or below, and then it tapered off back down to 5%, you know, up to the culmination of mean annual income. And then you use that extra money to basically give people a free pass on their forest excise tax if they're thinning their forest. And so that would incentivize people to keep growing their forest out, accumulating more carbon, would have no net cost to the state treasury. But of course, it would be roundly opposed by every single timber interest in Olympia. So that's why it's a thought experiment, and it's not yet enacted into law. I think here at 4:30, I want to make sure we get to some of the questions and comments from the very informed and illustrious people we have with us in the audience of participants. So I want to just encourage people to, if you want to ask your question or make a brief comment live, or put it in the chat if you're not feeling not wanting to go on camera and ask it live. This would be a great time to do that. Maybe we can take something out of the, pull something up out of the chat. Oh, here we go. Rosalind Hendricks writes from the DNR Small Forest Landowner Office. Lynda was asking about restoring ecological function through thinning. This is being done on state lands. Stands are modeled on the length of time that it takes to grow into northern spotted owl habitat. And in instances where that may be reduced by thinning, those management options are looked at and implemented as appropriate. Comments, panelists? Is that a fair statement, Paula?
Yeah, there's definitely under DNR's HCP, there are areas where they are where they agreed as part of the their incidental take permit to thin and restore spotted owl habitat from younger stands. And I do believe they have been diligently applying thinning practices. I mean, I understand from discussions with some of the DNR executives in the timber sales or the forest management branch of it that they would like to do more, but they're limited by they're limited by the amount of money they have. So under Lynda gave a nice little primer about the trust land lawsuit that's going on, and so like within their constraints and the current interpretation of the trust mandate puts real constraints on DNR. And they have a certain amount of money that they get back from every timber sale, and that they run the agency based on. I think that they, in some instances, they get 25% on the dollar, and I think there's a few other instances where they can get up to 30. But they use that money to keep the lights on, to have their foresters out on the ground setting up timber sales, and they run models to try to figure out how they optimize their delivery of revenue while they're doing all of that. And those models have them not do as much thinning as they otherwise would. And then the cost of all of that work is going up, and the amount of income they're getting for selling timber sales is staying about the same. It's staying relatively flat. So they don't have as much money to put up those kinds of sales that Rosalind was talking about. Their rates of habitat restoration in those places where they've committed to do so are lower than we wish they would. And so it would require, and sort of regardless of the outcome of the lawsuit, I think that that society is going to need to decide to invest more money in DNR being able to do that kind of thing. Money from the capital budget or money from the general fund to be able to allow DNR to do more habitat creation thinnings would be a really good thing. But indeed, they are doing, I think, as much as they can at this point.
Yeah, I'll just comment that the habitat conservation plan that is being considered for state lands in Oregon includes restoration activities in habitat conservation areas within that HCP to try to restore habitat for some of those species would be listed in the incidental take permit. It includes owls and murrelets, but red tree voles, Pacific martin, and a few others.
I think there's one other piece of the kind of narrative around forestry that's changed a lot, at least in my perspective, in the last couple decades, I see this even just looking over the archive of some of your stories recently, Lynda. It's the role of Native people and First Nations and Indian country in forest management, and was wondering if any of you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean that's very true, and I see that as wholly welcome and a good thing. And we have some major timber tribes in Washington, Colville, Yakima, and they've been fighting the loss of forests to fire. I mean, they're dealing with catastrophic fires that are taking out forests that are important for them beyond timber. They're also important for medicinal plants, berries, habitat for animals. They're also a big part of their budget. I mean, Colville took about a 10% budget hit during some of those fires a couple summers ago, and their frustration is that all the resources go to the places with houses because that's just forest. And so Lake Chelan second homes are taken care of, but the land base that is everything to them, barrens. So they've been through a very hard school of what happens when climate changes with regard to forest, and I think that they are stepping more and more into the public conversation about management questions, and that's a good and helpful thing. I think that in Washington, the presence of the tribes in terms of how they step into these situations, whether it's about salmon or rivers or forests. The treaty rights, the Stevens treaties in Washington State covered a vast area, by the way. I mean, all the way from Flathead area in Montana to Neah Bay in the furthest northwest tip, all the way down to Olympia. These treaties guaranteed not only salmon, but rights to gather off the reservation of medicinal plants, roots, berries, hunting. If you don't have forests, those aren't very meaningful rights. And so I'm sort of wondering when this conversation about when is a deal and when is a deal broken, when it will start migrating from the salmon conversation into the forest conversation. And I haven't heard it yet, but I don't know that it won't happen. So, that's a dynamic that's very real, and we'll see what happens next.
I guess in Oregon, I'd say that any conversation around forest management on tribal lands becomes an international conversation, because every tribal nation has its own goals, objectives in the way that they approach the management of their forests. And certainly there are some commonalities among the tribal nations, but there are also some significant differences. And I think we just need to try to learn what we can from some of those tribal nations in terms of how they're treating their forests to achieve their cultural goals. By the same token, work with them when they would like us to work with them when they run into issues that they're having trouble with. So I think it's just a highly varied landscape here in Oregon in terms of how the tribal nations are approaching forest management. But traditional ecological knowledge is certainly coming up as a consideration in many people's minds when it comes to how we might approach forest management for the future, particularly the use of burning, but beyond that too.
Kate, please.
Thanks for this great conversation. I was wondering, I just came from the Mass Timber Conference yesterday, and there's a lot of money looking at carbon. And I was wondering how worried this community here and we all should be about carbon offsets that add very little additionality or questionable additionality, or do other protection for ecosystem services. How worried we should be about that, and how much energy we should be directing towards kind of reforming that. Brenda had this great list of 7 things, and where there's so much that needs attention. How much attention should we put towards worrying about that?
I want to say that I was surprised when Hillary Franz announced her carbon offset, her carbon reserve, how negative the comments were. I mean, our commenters on our newspaper stories, they're always pretty negative, but honestly, I was kind of surprised. It seemed like every single person was saying, it's just greenwashing. This is a fake, and you're bait and switch, never, and so obviously, they did hire a firm to verify what they do. But I'm very aware that there is a big question. Well, do we want to just make it easy for polluters to keep polluting, or maybe we ought to try to stop it at the source? It's this old question of, do we want to keep running after the pollution that's already out there? Maybe we could do something else and try to subvert the pollution instead. So as to your point of how real is this stuff and how much should we worry about it and how much additionality are we really getting? That's a great question. And for myself, it's on the to-do list. I mean, I think that in terms of understanding what we're really getting and making sure that it isn't just happy talk for everybody, that seems like a really central job. And I feel the same way about all these, ecological thinnings and green forest products and so forth. It's, the old trust but verify thing. Is it real? I don't know. There's only one way to find out. And it's going to be one one thing at a time. They're all different. Every place is different. Every setup is different. I don't think you can generalize about any of these things.
I was in a meeting last week, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, around some of these issues. And a prominent member of one of the state boards, not Board of Forestry, mentioned that carbon credits are simply a license to pollute.
There you go.
And so that was an interesting perspective. I hadn't heard it put quite that bluntly before, but it does raise some significant issues about whether or not we're really seeing additional carbon sequestration, or whether or not it's just allowing more people to emit more greenhouse gases. Interesting, the Mass Timber Conference, we have a Tallwood Institute here at OSU who focus their work on that. And the questions I've been asking around that is, what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with going into actually building and creating some of this this product, and not just the creation of the product itself. I'm talking about the greenhouse gas emissions associated with clear cutting, spraying, planting, everything associated with management, everything associated with the transportation system. And if it's just the drop in the bucket and we can store that carbon for 150 or 200 years, that sounds great. But if it's a significant portion of it and that material is going to be turned over in a landfill in 20 years, I'm not sure that that's really the best approach to go. And so I think there has been, and there continue to be more refined life cycle analyses being done with that kind of product. And I think the more they're fine-tuned, the more we'll feel either more or less confident about that being a good way to go to store carbon.
Yeah, I'll take an additional shot at your question, Kate, about offsets. So, there are offsets operate in different systems. And so, for instance, the state of California has a regulated cap and trade system, and now Washington does too, just based on last year. And within those systems, offsets are, they're essentially a price containment system. And that's how they were originally designed. And so, polluters have to either reduce their pollution at the source, or they have to buy an emission allowance from another polluter who was more efficient at reducing their pollution at the source, or they can buy an offset, right? But what both California and Washington have done, and Washington's learned from California's lessons, is they've really limited the overall amount that any regulated entity can use offsets to meet their compliance obligations. So in that context, there is not a danger of CO2 emissions not actually being reduced, because it's I think it's 8% in California. It started at 8%, and then it's ramping down to 4%. And I think in Washington it starts at 5% and ramps down. And so it's a relatively small part of the whole system. And then the other governor on it is the quality of the protocols. So, I've helped develop several projects under California's protocol, and they're enormously rigorous. I mean, it takes a lot of time and money. Lynda mentioned that Nisqually Carbon Project, and I was a lead project developer on that. And I didn't sleep for months and thought a couple of times I might have to take out a second mortgage on my house to pay back the land trust for their investment, because we may not make it. But I mean, so many hoops to jump through, and lots of measurements. So in those contexts, I don't worry about those being real or additional. Some of these voluntary protocols are a little less. They're a little harder to wrap your arms around. And so the one that DNR chose is, I'm not as worried about the additionality requirements as I am the permanence. So permanence is the amount of time in which there's a commitment to keep the carbon on the ground, or carbon in the forest, for which you're getting an offset credit. And the American Carbon Registry's commitment period is only 40 years. And, California's is 100. And it's not 100, it's not a total of 100, it's 100 past every year that you sell an offset credit. So if you're going to sell offset credits from your project for 20 years, then, you essentially have a 120-year commitment to closely monitor and to, do ground verification. And so that's a pretty long period of time. 40, I worry that we're not really doing that much. And so in full disclosure, the Nisqually Community Forest is developing a project under that same protocol, but they're putting additional there's additional language in the deed restriction on the property that is going to require them to essentially keep that carbon in the ground permanently. And so I don't think we know enough yet about DNR's new project so I'm not going to throw darts at it. And I did have a conversation with the DNR staff person, is that they're aware that it's only 40 years and their intent is to protect, the stands that they're going to put in their carbon project, they intend to protect permanently, but they will need to come up with some mechanism to do so. So the protocol by itself is not that strong. But there are lots of other forest projects under that protocol that don't have those additional backups. And so I do worry about, people claiming, companies that are buying those credits and claiming that they're, doing good things for the environment, and yet not having something that's actually going to make a difference in the atmosphere. But the other thing about a voluntary market is it's entities that usually buy from those markets don't otherwise have to reduce their emissions. So it's an important social discussion, and we should keep a close eye, and we should have good controls over the protocols that are used. And anyone who makes a claim, any voluntary entity that makes a claim that they've reduced their emissions through these offsets, that those need to be looked at really closely.
Feeling less worried or more worried? I'm feeling more worried. How long ago was that Nisqually deal that you did? That's a ways, right? Isn't that back 10 years or something?
Not quite. It was 2014 when we sold the first batch of credits.
Yeah.
Yep. And they just did their first 6-year re-verification. So every 6 years, they have to go back and remeasure the trees in the field and have the verifiers come out. In between, you can do desk verifications, but every 6 years, you have to have a third-party verifier come out and make sure that not only that everything's on the ground, but that your measurements match their measurements.
Yeah, that sounds really righteous. Have you seen the forest lately?
Me? Yes. Yeah. Yes.
How's it looking?
Awesome.
Good to know.
I don't know if Justin is still on the call he's kind of involved there too. Yeah, I see him down there. He can verify.
He can vouch.
He can.
All right, well, we're getting close to the end of time, and suddenly we have hands. So I want to go to those hands. Let's take Klaus, whom I saw first.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it seems like all of this discussion is part of a bigger issue. What do you really want from the forest, or the role the forest plays? And obviously we have multiple expectations, and some of them will align, like longer rotation may have some spiritual benefits, certain biodiversity benefits, as well as carbon storage. And other ones, there's a potential conflict on that. You can't get early cereal habitat and dense forest with carbon storage. You said there's some potential discrepancy. So to me, it really comes down of what do we want from the forest where, and the where meaning both in terms of the landscape, the more productive forest can be used in different ways. And also, of course, the ownership pattern comes into it, because we have, more control over certain ownership than others. And so it's really figuring out where's the most efficient way to produce which benefit of the forest that I think we need to sort out in the future. If you look at the forest in the bigger societal context, obviously. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. I think that sums things up really well. I guess I would point out that lengthening rotations doesn't eliminate the opportunity for developing early successional conditions, especially diverse early successional conditions, where some of that wood is kept on the site and allowed to store carbon a little bit longer, although of course it's releasing CO2 as well. But I think the time frame is really an important issue here. So what do we want? Where do we want it? And when do we want it? Right? When is the forest going to meet our expectations in terms of all of these different values that we have for it? And inherent in all of that is the fact that there's still a market for the wood.
I would say to Klaus's point as well, I'm looking back at the red map that Paula pulled out at the beginning of our conversation. I've got it over here on my second screen. You know, you can't look at that and not respond with a sense that we need to start changing what we're doing. I mean, we've been at this for 150 years. Look where we are. There's not a lot out there that hasn't already been converted by clear cut. So, you know, to Klaus's point, what do we want? Where do we want it? I would say in those places that have not been converted, either because they're legacy or whatever they are, you know, that stands apart as a separate kind of place anymore versus all of the rest of it that's already been converted. If you want wood fiber, I would say the places where it's already been converted to wood fiber production farms would be the place you'd want to look. Whereas if you have just a few little points of not already clear cut left, yeah, think about that a lot, I think, with what little is left out there. And that is the new conversation that's surfacing in Washington. And when I talk about erosion of the social license, it's usually in that context, in the sense of really that too. So I think Klaus is right. It's what do you want, where do you want it? But I also think it's what is on the landscape. You know, what is there today, and you know, what is its highest and best use? And here in Washington, that's a conversation that's a different conversation today. And for sure, Paula's point about the Supreme Court decision may be providing some more margin for DNR to work in. Either way, we are where we are.
Yeah, I just respond. I agree, Lynda, but I think that the greatest opportunity for getting what we want, where we want it, and when we want it is on those lands that have already been cut.
Yeah.
Because they occupy such a large percentage of the land.
Yeah.
And so regrowing those forests into a structure and composition and scale that will meet our expectations under a very uncertain future is really both the opportunity and the challenge that I see.
Mhm.
That's interesting.
And I agree wholeheartedly with Brenda there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you do it? How do you do it?
Yeah, I would venture to say that through ecological thinning and other sort of clever silvicultural techniques, that's really where you can do some habitat restoration at the same time as you can extract some fiber to meet the economic expectations that society has of the forest.
Mm-hmm.
And focus that on those places that are, like you say, these monocultural stands that are resulting from clear cuts. We had one more hand from Sandy Leitzig that I think we could, if I'm saying that right, whether I'm saying it right or not, please, if you have a question, please jump in.
Oh, yeah, no, it's Leitzig, and so that's pretty close. Thanks. It was just actually a comment. I appreciated Paula's explanation of the compliance versus voluntary markets, because there's a big distinction between the two. And the last comment I had was on that in the compliance market, you know, they do have that declining emissions. So every year these companies are allowed to pollute less and less, right? So even if they are able to buy some of those offsets, you know, 4% or whatever every year, the next year it's going to be even less because there's that decline. So I think it's really great that Washington's also adopting that with this Climate Commitment Act into their policies. I think that's pretty important. I also just wanted to say that I spent a long time as a stewardship forester for conservation districts and the NRCS, and there are a lot of tools out there to get closer and closer to these goals that we're talking about of ecological forestry, right? So I actually help develop compliance offset projects, forestry projects now. And we work with landowners who do selective thinning, and then we get them cost share contracts to do forest health thinnings. And then they're getting carbon funds, right? So yes, that price for carbon isn't there yet, but it's getting closer. And as some of these companies are getting more efficient, they're getting a better price for carbon as well. So I'm excited that Washington's joining. And I think, you know, we have some pilot projects up in Washington, and I think we're getting closer, especially with smaller industrial forest landowners, the ones that we're really focusing on. So, so yeah, we're getting closer. I'm optimistic about it.
All right. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour here, so I'd like to take a moment to thank our panelists who've taken time out of their afternoon, and who knows, maybe even the potential to go play in the unseasonable April snow, and join us here today. And I'll just hand it back to Rowan for a couple of announcements if she has any as we wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining us here.
Yes, thank you, Seth, and thank you to all the panelists. That does wrap it up for today. We do have 2 more sessions the next 2 Thursdays at the same time using the same Zoom link. So we hope you all will join us then. Next week, we'll be focusing on diversifying forest revenue and values. So hope to see you then. And until then, hope you guys have a wonderful week and wonderful weekend. Thank you.
All right. All right.